Ryan Ray and Ben Samuels present Bring in the Closers, a podcast on making deals and doing business.
Welcome to another edition of Bring in the Closers. Ryan Ray, along with my good friend, the one, the only, Ben Samuels. Ben, how are you doing, sir?
You know, generally I tell you I'm doing pretty well, but this week has been pretty rough. Got hit with strep throat and some illness, so I've been down and out. I guess depending on kind of how you look at it, I either picked a really good week or a really bad week to go down. Because a really good week, I didn't really have a whole heck of a lot, pressing that I had to get off my plate. Not a great week because I didn't get a chance to go with the family and hang out. I was, in bed and pretty miserable. But other than that, looking forward to a new month, new week. Going forward,
it is a new month. That is right. It is a new month. It is a new month. I like the half glass full glass half full. I'm not educated, people. I'm not educated.
Thank you, Nate.
Yeah,
I appreciate that, Nate.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Half glass full. The glass is full of liquid mentality you have there. So I appreciate that. And I will say, as a slight programming note, I did record a 30 to 40 minute interview with Nate about my time in China, which will be on this podcast feed and the other two podcast feeds I record. So if you're curious about that, it is there. If you've heard it on one of the other shows, it is simply the same thing. So no need to go and listen to it again, unless you love hearing my voice, and then in which case you can. Other news, Ben, real quick, is the Texas Oil and Gas podcast hit 200 plus 5-star reviews, which means producer Nate.Hansen is going into Lake Granbury in early January when it is a wee bit cold. So thank you if you left a review on this. If you're one of these listeners who left a review over there, well, thank you again. But in the spirit of holiday cheer, we don't want any more reviews on Texas Oil and Gas podcast because there could be something else to happen. So we were trying to mitigate that. So therefore, all 5-star reviews come right here, right now. That's what we're looking for. Which we have one. Go ahead, Ben.
No, I was just going to say, I appreciate you trying to run the show and steer the boat away from where we were going to go with the conversation. But just real quick plug, please, 5-star review. Make sure, though, that you continue to put the ones on the Texas Oil and Gas podcast, because while Nate is going to be getting wet here in about a month, there's another trigger. There's another incentive, I should say, to get some other people a little bit wet, a little bit cold.
Yeah,
and so
we're good.
Please. No,
we're good. I mean, why not rate this show 5 stars?
If we reach 225 reviews,
can we just? Let's just do both. It only takes a few minutes. Just do one, hop over to the other, do the other.
And that would make Ben happy. That would make Ben very happy.
Wow.
I'm just trying to promote the podcast, Ryan. I don't understand why you don't want the positive reinforcement, and I don't understand why you don't want the 5 stars. Do you want to tell us about that?
No, there's not. There's no. Getting 19 more 5-star reviews on the Texas Oil and Gas podcast might be wonderful. Might result in me having to do something very similar to what Nate has to do. So let's tame let's don't set the expectation, Ben.
19. I bet I could pay I bet I could pay 19 people $10 a review to just hop over there real quick. It's worth a couple $100 for me, no problem.
If you knew the right 19 people, while they would hate to leave me the 5-star review, they would do it because of the reward they would get. So it's just about finding. You have to pay anyone. But speaking of reviews, Ben, you were complaining the other day that we're not getting any to Nate and myself, and I went and looked. We do. We have 9 5-star reviews. So thank you, everyone. And we have a written one, which comes from Jacob Suri, Sure. It says, Ryan Ray continues to show he's the best podcast co-host of all time. I should stop there, but there's more great content as well. So thank you for that 5-star review. And so, what else can be said?
I just want to point out the fact that I love that review because you're the co-host. Because you got there. What's this phrase? Something rises all boats. Tide rises all boats.
High tide lifts all boats. I can't get the water. I can't get the water in the glass, but I got the boat one right.
There you go. So you've got me on this one. You've got Josh on the other. You're just riding coattails. It's pretty good.
I'll take it however it comes at this point for putting up with you. So there we go. Oh, yeah, shots fired. Whoa, it's getting feisty early. Let's get into the show, though. No guest today, so me and Ben will just probably make fun of each other for the next hour. Ben, we wanted to talk, I know, about why conferences suck so bad. And I should preface this by saying I have one conference in which was probably the best conference I've ever attended. And I have some reasons to why that is. But let's start with maybe why the conferences that we regularly attend we leave frustrated with, maybe. Or where do you want to start at, buddy?
Yeah, I want to kind of rephrase it or reframe it a little bit. I mean, it's not just generically that at a high level they quote unquote suck. I mean, I think it's really what I think we're seeing is these industry groups and networking groups and associations have a need and feel a need to provide value and put out content and bring attention to themselves. But in addition to that, also they feel compelled, I think, to educate the public. All of that being said, it's also a money driver, right? It's a revenue producer. I think where I get frustrated, and I think where you and some others certainly get frustrated, is that there seems to be very little thought put into who's going to be in the room, what do they know already, what can actually be taught to these people that is new, as opposed to just like part of the echo chamber. And really, it's so. As a specific example, I just went just recently to a Produce Water Society conference. The title of it was Intro to Water Management and Groundwater Processes in the Permian Basin, or something like that. Put on by the Produce Water Society, which is one of the preeminent associations in the space. And so I went in. I started this Source Rock Midstream company and started doing some consulting in the space in the last year. But I don't have any operational expertise. I never went through a course to learn any of these things. So everything that I know about the entire space is completely by things that I've read and by osmosis. And so I went into the conference really looking for the nuts and bolts of the crux of these issues. It was a 5-hour course. It was put on by the Produce Water Society. For the first 2 hours, it was from 8 to 1 on a Tuesday. From about 8 to about 10 or 10:30, all they talked about, the entire 2.5 hours, was the intro to fracking course. They didn't talk about water whatsoever. And then they brought up a speaker that talked about for about 90 minutes, and at least a half a dozen times in his talk, he looked at a slide and said, I'm not really sure what that's referring to, but let me talk about this instead. Or would say, I don't really know if that's right, but let me point you in this direction. And so, I left that course. I left at 1:00. I don't know if I picked up anything new, and that's from someone that's relatively new in the space. There were about 50 people in attendance. They addressed it actually at one of the breaks. One of the proctors did, or one of the people up there did say, we don't really know who's in the room today, so we're going to give you kind of more of a high level. That's a really like a specific example of, so, you brand a course or you market a course as Intro to Water Management and Groundwater Processes in the Permian Basin, and it's a 5-hour course, and it's in Midland. The other thing is it's in Midland, Texas. I mean, that's not, you're not talking to people like, in New York City or in Boston. I mean, if you're in Midland, Texas, you have to understand your audience. And I left at 1:00 with nothing new, with complete. It wasn't of value at all. And so, and that's again one example. But you look at these time and time again. I mean, these conferences are, $400 on the cheap end. They're usually $600, $900, $1,500 a pop. And then you walk in, and basically it's a big mixer, and you exchange business cards, and it's good for networking to a degree. But if you go to enough of them, you tend to see the same people at all of them. And so at some level, that no longer becomes relevant or no longer becomes nearly as important as it was. And so you're left with, okay, so why did I pay this money if the speakers aren't, there just seems to be no impetus to actually provide the value given. And so that's kind of, I want to set the table in that way, and then we can kind of go from there. But I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I've given 3, I think, presentations at conferences before, something like that. Maybe 4, I think, something like that. Anyways, some in South Africa and some here in the States. And I don't really volunteer or ask to do those anymore, mainly because walking away from them, I'm not sure I was really adding value, and it's like, okay, I'm not sure this is good, because the room is kind of diverse, and they weren't exactly the same scenario you're talking about, but I would listen to other people's presentations who were maybe even better presenters than me, and I was like, this really isn't adding any value. I'm listening to you, that's great, but not really, there's no real value here. So if they're not doing it, then I'm probably not doing it, and if I'm not doing it, then if I'm not getting value and no one's getting value, then why? Then there's better things for me to do. And so, I feel like part of the issue you hit on a minute ago is correct, is they don't know who's in the room. Whether they should or not, we can parse out why they should or why they shouldn't. But that goes a long way, because if you're bringing in, if you have an open conference, right, anyone can register to attend. What you find is the people that most want to attend are salespeople. They're trying to make a sale. Business development people, they won't make a sale. Unless you say it is an extremely engineering, like how to pour concrete without it freezing in sub-zero temperatures. Okay. Unless you sell that type of concrete, you ain't going to that, right? But if it's just kind of like, well, how does concrete, or how to lay a pipeline in the Permian? Well, if you're a guy that sells the pipeline guys, you might want to show up. And so then you've created a kind of a wide audience. Now, the problem is if you get very narrow, those presentations are very technical and they're not necessarily that entertaining, because you get into really the nuts and the bolts, which is probably more what you wanted, but it's also kind of hard to, it's kind of hard. I am sympathetic on some level. It's hard because it's hard to kind of hit it in stride. Whereas like if you take a college course, which you graduate college, they do the course over and over, they get feedback and they can kind of adapt it. Here, you're kind of saying, well, we're going to put something on like once a year, and it's probably a little harder to hit the right target audience and get the content streamlined. So does that make sense?
It does, although I guess my response to that is, using my example again, if you're promoting a course and going to be teaching a course on intro to water management, you can't spend the first 2 hours of the course talking about fracking.
Agree. No, I agree with that. So, yes. Yeah.
What I mean more specifically is if you promote a course and you put out an agenda, I would argue that you have to follow that. You have to, if you're going to teach a course on intro to water management, you can't get deviated on something else. But and another thing I want to talk about, and I don't want to mention specifics, and we can talk about it in brief if we'd like to. But I think one of the other things is that a lot of the times at these conferences, the talk is being given by someone that's representing a company that was a sponsor at the event. Mm-hmm. The person giving the talk isn't necessarily the industry expert or even the company expert about that thing. Mm-hmm. They've just been deputized to give the talk. And so what happens with that is that the person isn't familiar with the slides, and so they're kind of reading them along with you. Mm-hmm. They may or may not have all the information necessary for the talk. And it's almost like checking the box of, okay, so we were a sponsor, we got to give a talk, we gave the talk. Right. As opposed to, if I was putting on the event, if I was the organizer, okay, so if a sponsor wants to give a talk, that's great. But let's make sure that talk is of value. You don't, like in my opinion, you don't get the stage just because you paid money to be a sponsor. If you're gonna take 10, 15, 20, 40 minutes of the entire convention floor or the entire audience's time, I think that you're compelled, in my opinion, the company or the presenter should be compelled to bring the goods. I mean, if we're sitting there, another example, I was sitting at a conference about 2 months ago, and I mentioned this one to you as well. Again, it was about water management. This was arguably the largest. It's put on by Heart Energy. It's arguably the largest. It's called the Executive Oil Conference. It's arguably one of the largest ones that Heart Energy does on a yearly basis. There was a room of about 300 people. There was an entire day from 8 to 4 of talks given. Again, this was I'm very relatively brand new in that room. I was probably the least experienced in the entire market of the entire room, and I didn't pick up anything. There wasn't anything that I picked up an entire day. And so, if that's the case for me, how do you think that the 25-year vet sitting in row 2 feels?
Right. No, I agree. And we talked about that on the show, I believe, when you came back from it. Some of your frustrations we had on we had a guest.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
But no, let me contrast that with the best conference I've ever been to, and tell you why it was and why I think it was, and let's see if this can help. I'm curious your thoughts and if this will put us in the right direction. So, I was at the Bush China conference. What was it? 2 months ago now, something like that. Late October. And a month and a half, I guess now. And I've told them, and they're not paying me to say this or anything, but it was the best conference I've ever been to, and I've wondered why. And so the talks were pretty good; they were interesting. one of the deals was the talks were off the record, so you couldn't. Of course, you're not signing NDAs, so I guess people could go and divulge. But I'm not going to come on here and say what was said. But you got to hear from Neil Bush. You got to hear from the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. Now they were writing prepared statements; they weren't off the cuff, just talking. But you did get to hear high level people talking. You got to hear experts from different parts of various industries talk about the U.S.-China relations. But the other thing that happened, Ben, was when we would be meeting, like if I met you at that conference, we would just start talking about what we do and why we do it. And then we'd almost kind of go to, well, how can we help each other out? Is there some connection here? And the only thing I can attribute to that is a couple things. One, we all understood what the dynamic of the Bush-China Foundation is, which is to help promote U.S.-China relations. Two, it was an exclusive event. I mean, you could go, but you would have to pay a bunch of money, and you kind of had to be invited by someone else, and Bob off the street just didn't walk into this thing. So then you create an air in which everyone already feels like the other people in the room are people who can do things. And the third thing is the Bush-China Foundation, part of what they do is they kind of vet people for each other. So like if you're trying to deal with someone from China, they'll kind of help you with that, or vice versa. So it created this. The only thing I can guess is it creates this environment which, if I meet you at a conference, I don't know you, I'm like, okay, well, who's Ben Samuels? What do you do? What are you trying to sell me? Should I try to sell you something? Do I need to, and we're trying to make this, like you say, that it's the same old people, and you're trying to make these connections and go on. Or if I've seen you, oh, hey, Ben, how's it going? If this was a unique environment, now maybe if they had one once a year or 4 or 5 a year, it might change, but this really was different. And it feels like it was those factors that changed it. And if I think about the conferences that you're talking about, like the hard energy ones or the Produced Water Society, you kind of lose the exclusivity of it. You're not really sure why everyone's there. You kind of presume everyone's there to pitch you on something. Whereas in the Bush-China deal, it was, we're working towards this goal. Sometimes this goal is, there's business to be had. Sometimes it's just understanding from a different perspective. And so it just had a different feel to it. And that's why I call it the best conference, because a lot of great contacts, a lot of good content, but I didn't have to go through the normal dog and pony that I have to do at a Doug or a whatever type conference like you're talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the two things that I would point out to that, number one, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't sound like that the Bush-China conference, it doesn't sound like the primary reason for that conference was to educate people on a certain topic, right? And so if the primary reason is to put people in the room together to see if there's synergy and for business development, just by definition at its basis, that's a very different, as you said, it's a very different feel, it's a very different value add proposition, et cetera, right? Because if you're not standing up there and talking about the something technical. I'm talking about the conferences where, networking is a part of it, but the reason that you're going to that conference and sitting in that room is to listen to the talk and in theory learn something about what's being talked about.
I mean, the pushback, I don't know, I don't want to speak for the Bush-China people and what they would say, but it was talks all day long. There was no booths, there was no vendors. It was talks all day long, every day. And then you had a handful of networking breaks. But when you came out of the networking break, we all kind of had this idea of this is. Does that make? Well, go ahead.
But everybody, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but everybody in the room had one goal in mind. Who can I do business with here? What's that business look like? What can I do to further that along? In these other conferences, there's some people that want to be sold something. There's some people that want to sell you something. There's some people that are just there to learn. There's some people so you have a diverse group at these other like hard energy, et cetera, conferences that at the Bush-China, I think at a high level, everyone in that room, by invite or not, was there for a specific reason, which is to network with each other and figure out kind of what you could do together. Is that a fair assessment or am I just off base?
I think it's probably fair on some level. I would say this is that the people that I talked to that were interested, some people were there for education because they were just, whatever their deal was. Like there was someone from one of the ports that was there, and so I don't know what deals maybe he was trying to make or not trying to make. But it goes back to something that you touched on there. The people that were there to do business were there to do deals. They weren't there to pitch and sell. And that's that. We talked about that before, but that makes a big difference because if I sit down with you and the preface is, what do you do with China? And you're like, well, I do this. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's not really what I do. And you're like, but this has been my experience. Because if you're trying to sell something, you're trying to convince someone. If you're trying to broker a deal with mutually interested partners, you can get to it pretty quickly, and then you can get out of it pretty quickly because, if there's commonality and similarities, then you know that. Or like there's people there that were doing, in the pharmaceutical space. So that's not really anything I know anything about or whatever. So come across them, it's kind of like, oh, okay, hey, curious, what are some of the larger, you take a larger issue that you've heard about. How does that tie into what I'm hearing? And then you move on. But they were never, it didn't feel like that pressure of me trying to sell them on something was sitting there, right? It was, whereas some of these conferences, I think that's what you're getting at is I'm here to sell, or I'm here to, and if you're a oil and gas company and you send your CEO, well, that dude's going to get pitched like 700 times if he walks around the room, right? By every service company in the industry.
And I fully understand. I mean, another element to this that I don't think we've touched on yet is a major difference between the conferences like the U.S., the Bush China Foundation conference, or like any of these other ones that I'm talking about are, at a high level, anybody that's talking on stage has to keep something behind the curtain, right?
Mm-hmm.
They can't just say, "Hey, this is exactly how we do everything. Here's what it looks like. Here's the thing behind the curtain." And so the reason I bring that up is because that in and of itself creates this element of having to put in some more forethought into what am I going to talk about? How is this valuable? Because at the same time, if Operator X gets up and stands up there and just gives a 15-minute presentation on, their current production and their current business model and what they've done the last 12 months. Anybody that's paying attention already knows all that information.
Right.
And so you've completely wasted the time of everybody in the audience listening, right, as opposed to if you just, I'm sure anybody in this industry, any company in this industry, if you gave a little bit of thought into who's going to be in the room, what can I share that would be of value, that would be interesting, that's not giving away the secrets, there's an answer there. But there just doesn't seem...
Right. I was going to say, I wonder if you reverse engineer it like this. If you said, let's just take XTO, just to pick a random name, it doesn't matter, insert producer name here, and XTO and EOG and Marathon or Oxy or whoever, just a handful of people. But they were going to give talks about issues that they face with parent-child issues or water issues or whatever. And they gave a 20-minute talk to an exclusive room of vendors who paid their way to get in or whatever, and they told you for 20 minutes, these are the problems that we face, and this is what we've seen. So when we frack a well, we have this problem, or whatever it is. That's actually more beneficial than them giving me a lecture on how to frack the well, because with the right room, you have vendors who might go, oh, we can actually solve that problem. And we could actually write an intelligent paper on how to handle this issue. Or you might hear or if you're a vendor, you go, oh, wow, I didn't even know companies were having that issue. I need to go figure out how to fix this issue so I can sell to them. That would be content that would be really valuable, because the E&P company said, hey, everyone's got deficits. I have deficits. You have deficits. We all have problems. Here's the problems I have. It's not Q&A. I don't want you to pitch me right here in front of everyone. But here's the problems we have. Here's how we've tried to tackle them. Here's what's worked. Here's what hasn't worked. 30-minute presentation. And at the end, we're done. We're not going to sit, because they don't want to get in the being sold to 100 people, and I get that. But now, if you're offer the service for that, maybe there's a spot to present a presentation to whoever the operations manager or whatever it is, or when you walk out, to call them and say this, that, or the other. Or like I said, you don't know how to solve it, but you begin that process. I think that is actually where the value could be if we just did it differently, instead of them trying to tell you some high level stuff that we all know and we're all sitting in there, because most people in there are probably just wanting to meet the speaker anyways. And I'd much rather be interested, can I solve their problems, than what are they doing that I could hear on a quarterly earnings call?
No, absolutely. And Nate, you can cut that this next part if we don't want to put it on air. But I mean, what we're talking about, I think, is, and Ryan, forgive me if I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but I mean, you and I have been talking about remedies to this without actually addressing this specifically for a long time. I think what you just painted is something that could be executed at a very high level and would be a fantastic value add as just an ancillary, add-on to conferences, not necessarily supplanting those. But if you can get, so like if you have operations guy at XTO stand up and talk to a room of 24 people that are in the service business that person is servicing, and that way they can provide present, hey, here are the issues that we're facing, here's what we're looking at,
right.
And again, just like you said, don't solicit right now, but here's what we're looking at. Go find a solution. Come back to me. Right. I think that would be immensely valuable. I think there would be a lot of traction with that. I think and I know you and I are working on some stuff like that offline, and hopefully next year. But those are the kind of things. I think those are the answers. But if you reverse engineer that and you bring it back into the conference sphere, those it's not necessarily. I mean, yes, there's a benefit to having it be a smaller group of like a couple dozen as opposed to like 300. But at the same time, the concept of let's give some thought to how we can actually provide value and actually benefit the people in the room that spent $1,000 and a full day to be here. I think you get the answer.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And one of the things I talked about on the Textile Guest podcast this morning was we keep hearing about how bad the industry is doing right now. They're not making money. Historically, these ideas won't get a lot of traction because everyone's so secretive, but if you're a company that's sitting there and you're going, you know what, I'm not sure we're going to make it through 2020. We have to figure out ways to cut cost. It would behoove you to take up some of these ideas and figure out how to implement them on your own so that you can figure out what's going on. One of the things that I don't know at the C-suite level how much is thought about this. I know on the mid-management level it's thought of on some, but, Ben Samuels or Ryan Ray's competitor, Ben Samuels' competitor, whoever, because we work for a multitude of companies, we see how things are done. We see the good ways they're done, the bad ways they're done, and then there's a lot of stuff done that we don't really even have an input on because it's kind of outside of our purview. The secretiveness, which I understand and respect that's in the industry, also harms it because there are ways to make your company more efficient. And you don't hear the companies calling us up. What I hear, I'll be honest with you, Ben, I hear vendors talking to me going, hey, we can save this, and let's just assume this is true for argument's sake. We can save this company 30% on their frac costs or whatever it is. But, the guy in charge of that, he's all for it. But this person over here, their bonus isn't tied to it, so they're not motivated to do anything. Now, I'm not saying every one of those phone calls I get is true, but let's just say that some of them are. If you're the C-suite, and you don't realize that that's a problem that you have, which is making sure that the vendors from various departments that are targeting your departments are working together inside of your company, then you are costing, if you have a publicly traded company, you're costing your stockholders money. You're costing yourself a bonus. So we have to change that narrative. And I don't know what it takes to change the narrative, but it feels like on the outside we can look at it and say, okay, there's a lot of things that you guys could do better. We can't give away, your competitors' technology to you, but we could definitely advise you on things that you're not even thinking of.
So I don't want to light our industry on fire here and call people out or blaze a new trail here. But I think what that comes down to is it comes down to ego. You have too much ego in these rooms and too much ego at these C-suite levels that if a service provider can actually provide value, it's we can do it better, or no, we can do that. We don't need you, or that's not a problem, or we're just going to write that off. It's a loss, but that's just how we do things. I mean, how many times in your business? Because I'm not on the service side. How many times in your career have you heard an operator or someone that you're trying to bring on as a client say something along the lines of, we can do that, or that's not a big deal. We're losing money, but it doesn't matter. So, how many times?
Well, yeah. I mean, I could give stories. I'll give you a story I just heard the other day. Talking to a vendor, and anyways, they were saying that they get calls to do X, Y, and Z, and that sometimes because the project that the person wants done isn't large enough, they'll call them back and say add $40,000 to $60,000 to $80,000 to the budget so that we can get it on an AFE and get it done. Just stop and think about that. Now, is $80,000 a lot? We talk about $5 million for a well or whatever. No, but that mentality. I mean,
if you do that 150 times a year, it adds up.
Exactly. And so those are the types of things I think we're talking about. Is like, well, hey, and when he told me this, I mean, I wasn't sitting there like, stunned. I was like, yeah, okay, yeah. We all got our stories like that, and it was kind of funny. And for the point of the story he was telling, this is kind of okay. That's kind of funny, whatever. And but it's like, well, does the C-suite recognize that? Do they care? I don't know. But if they don't, and when Wall Street talks about cutting spending, Wall Street talks about oil and gas cutting spending. They have no clue. They have no clue about what cutting spending actually means. Wall Street's like, you cut spending by 15%. Okay, well, let me tell you something, Wall Street. It's a lot more going on than you buffoons in New York on Wall Street thinks going on. And I wonder about at the C-suite level if they're thinking through these things on how they can actually mitigate cost overtures. Do they have systems set up to where you need something done, but you can't get it done because it's not costing enough money? So then you incentivize people to charge you more money. That's so crazy.
So we've pivoted quite a bit from where we started.
I'm sorry, that's my fault.
No. But in response to that, I think we've talked about it a little bit on the podcast, but not at length. What we're seeing in the industry right now is exactly what you described. We're now seeing kind of the crux of Wall Street finally putting down their fist of like, listen, the ROI on these companies is not there. And the oil and gas companies realizing that I think we may have talked about this a couple episodes ago, but I think the conversation is changing from how much oil can we pull out of the ground, irrespective of how much it costs us? How much oil can we produce so that we can say that we pulled it out of the ground? Mm-hmm. To, how can we make this company the most profit possible? Mm-hmm. And you would think that those two things would be correlated, but in a lot of ways, I would argue that they're negatively correlated. Mm-hmm. That if you're doing one, the other one is going the other direction. Mm-hmm. Because if your focus is on profit per dollar invested or profit per share for the shareholders, you're probably not going to be focused on, or you're at the same time, you can't have a singular focus on let's produce, right? Because if you're focused on profit, you don't drill 3.5 mile laterals. You don't. There's so many different things, right? You drill. You operationally, it changes the picture. On a day to day, it changes the picture. Budget wise, across the board, if you're talking about profit is now more important than anything, as opposed to production is more important, you completely have changed the game. And so I think that we're seeing right now a lot of Wall Street money. We can talk about it on another podcast, but and these are rough numbers that I have picked up just kind of by association of reading through a bunch of documents or articles, etc. But there's an argument to be made that there's about $100 billion of levered debt out in the industry right now, just in the Permian Basin. Okay, that's going to be called on in the next 10 years. That's levered. That's $100 billion of levered debt. That's not even capital, right? That's and so and again, we can talk about this. We can explain what levered debt means at more length at a different time if we want to. But if you're looking at that, there's going to be so much attrition, and there's going to be so many of these companies that are going to get turned belly up, and there's going to be just a feeding frenzy of the mid majors buying up everybody below them because the conversation has changed so quickly, and they're just going to run out of time. They're going to run out of money. You're seeing the same thing in the mineral space. There have been a number of big mineral funds that have rolled up or at least significantly reduced their capex going into 2020. It's kind of nasty out there, and I think the reason but that's nothing to do with production numbers. We're obviously at an all-time high there. It has nothing to do with well economics. I'm not the operations guy, but I know enough to know that there's there are processes and ways to drill a well economically out in the Permian at like sub $40 oil, and if we're at 50, if we're at 58, we're not turning a profit. Like there's something seriously wrong with the picture.
Yeah, and. Yeah, you covered a lot of ground there, so I'm going to try to maybe pick up a couple things. One is, the idea about the length of the lateral. One of the things we had David Blattman come on Texas Oil and Gas Podcast a while back, and he talked about, even further back, he said that if you look at the Permian as a bunch of experiments that are going on, every day they're trying to figure out exactly the most efficient way to drill these horizontal wells in the Permian. That's one thing. And the second thing is, he said later on, a year or two later, was that horizontal wells, fracking wells, compared to conventional wells, requires more expertise than conventional wells does. And so we probably have a lot of folks out there in the Permian who aren't actually, I don't know if the right word is qualified, aren't the best men for the job, if that makes sense. Aren't the best men for the job, but they have the money, they have the staff, and so they go out there and do that, but they're probably not the actual right team for the job. And so some of this, you talk about attrition, some of this attrition I think we're going to see is because you do have folks who, they're not really skilled enough to do this. And let's be honest, doing a 3-mile lateral takes a lot of skill, and to get the efficiencies maximized out of it takes even more skill. Whereas you can do a 1-mile lateral and get better returns because you don't have the skill set. Deloitte told us a few weeks ago that the length of the lateral really depends on who's doing it, which kind of goes in that same sentiment. Some folks have long laterals and they get good results. Some folks have long laterals and they don't get good results. But Ben, it doesn't feel like there's conversation happening about how practices. Let's get out of our silos. Let's think about this. And so what happens is what you see, which is you go to conferences and there's just a lot of high-level talk and not a lot of little practical things. And listen, there's people far more plugged into the industry than me and you. So not like we're the number one ranked insiders or anything like that. I can just tell you just what I hear on the street, which is the same thing over and over again. And it's my same experience too. Same thing. They don't like to listen. They don't want to know what you have to say. The C-suite or this department, they're not connected. And it's not like you're trying to bash anyone. It's just simply saying, hey guys, maybe you should reconsider this. There are other ways. And not that we have all the answers, but like you say, I can't answer the questions, some of these questions, but there are people who can.
So I posted an article, it looks like just a couple of days ago, maybe yesterday, by Rystad Energy, who's, they put out a lot of data in the space. I'm just going to read a sentence in here because I think it codifies really well what we're talking about. It says, it's talking about the Delaware Basin, and it's talking about lateral length as opposed to, when compared to D&C cost. It says, in other words, a 9,500-foot lateral with 25% lower productivity per foot than a 4,500-foot lateral will still deliver identical F&D cost per barrel of oil equivalent. And so, if you're looking at things like that, okay, so it makes sense to drill, maybe it makes sense to drill a 1280, but there's argument to be made. Maybe it actually makes sense to drill two 640s as opposed to a 1280. And I understand now we're getting into like lease maintenance and all those kind of things. Sure. It's a more textured picture than just picking a lateral length. But I guess the point being, how in the world, and I guess I'm picking on the Chinese for a second, how in the world does Surge even conceptualize drilling a 17,800 foot lateral at any level? Number one, mm-hmm. But then how do they actually think it's a good idea to actually go out on the ground and actually do it? Other than the only reason I can think of is that they wanted to make the news, right? They wanted to draw the longest lateral. There's no data you can point to that makes sense that it was an economic decision that they thought that they would be more profitable by doing that. And if they did, that's another conversation. And they have some operational issues or whatever, right? But if they intended to do that, clearly weren't doing it profit minded, right?
Well, I go back to what Deloitte said. Deloitte said it depends on the operator. That they do see some longer laterals with operators are more effective than others. So I don't know about Surge's case. I do feel like the Surge thing, some is tied up with the news, obviously. So I think that. I think anyone drilling the longest lateral is tied up with the news on some level, right? So it doesn't matter if Surge, Samuels, Ray, whomever, you're trying to make your little headline there. Even if you thought it was the most profitable thing to do, you still would want everyone to know that you did the longest lateral. So I don't think you can. I don't think you can separate those two things. It's hard. It's hard with the private back companies because we don't get access to their information. And that's the thing about Rystad. You got to keep in mind is they're going off of the publicly traded companies, and they're not getting the information as much on the privately backed companies, and so it does kind of skew the numbers. But to go back to something here, Ben, as we kind of talk through this, why the conferences struggle, or why are they not very good, or why they suck, or however you want to phrase that. And listen, I don't want to be in the conference business like Hard Energy is. They're trying to they need 1,000 people to show up at their events to have a good show. Let's compare that with NAPE. NAPE, we hadn't talked about NAPE. One thing about NAPE is it has a unique ability to bring in decision makers and wheeler dealers on both sides of the table, buyers and sellers. So if you walk around NAPE, there's dudes with booths and they're trying to sell stuff, and there's dudes that have money and they're trying to buy stuff. Why do you think NAPE is, and I don't go to the presentations at NAPE, so I can't speak to those, but why do you think NAPE is able to do it better than Hart is? Is it because they're incentivizing people that want to buy and sell, and those aren't typically the big corporate XTO, EOG types, or something else? What is it about NAPE that gives them the ability? Because if you just walk around NAPE, you can at least get a vibe of what the market is just by walking around. For $400, you can get a pretty good vibe of what's going on. So why do you think that is that NAPE's got it better than maybe the Hart Energy does?
Number one, I think it's just it's the preeminence of that conference, right? I mean, anybody that's in the A&D space and oil and gas or surface space is going to be at NAPE, right? Mm-hmm. And so that being said, NAPE doesn't have, a conference a month, or, they have a conference in the summer, they have a conference in the winter. They used to have a Rockies conference, and they used to have one in Pittsburgh. They don't even do either of those anymore. They literally just have 2 a year. Mm-hmm. And so if you have 2 a year, you can stack the conference with the right speakers that are topical. But also I think that I do think that they do a really good job of making it they do a really good job of making sure the speakers at the events are not just getting out there and just talking about whatever. I mean, they have prospect review talks that mm-hmm. There's someone getting up there and giving you the actual very granular, this is exactly what we're doing. We need money. If you want to invest, come mm-hmm. talk to us. Mm-hmm. So it's a different conference because I think there's more of an impetus to actually provide the value. I mean, I think at a high level, I think they're doing it the right way. I think that they go ahead.
No. I was going to say one thing I thought about when you're talking is NAPE also, the vendors at NAPE aren't your typical vendors. So if you go to a pipeline conference, you're going to have construction guys, folks like myself, welding guys or whatever, which have a lot of business development type budgets to deploy to go to these events. I think it's $400 to walk NAPE, something like that. And I've heard people go, man, that's pretty expensive to walk the conference. And I'm like, $400, like that's really not. But it seems that price point is actually the right price point to make sure that while it's a big conference, you do kind of have it exclusive. And if you want a booth at NAPE and you're not a prospect, it's really expensive. So you really have to have like $6,000 to booth at NAPE. So if you're going to booth there, you really have to fork over a lot of money. So it's a huge conference, but maybe it does the way some of the things you point to and the price points do give it more of an exclusive feel because you don't have large, for Ben Samuels, he might go, I don't know, is it worth $400? I got to fly down there. I got to do a hotel. I don't know. The market's not that great right now. Okay, well, and so you don't go.
Well, so, two things. Number one, it's not just $400, right? It's $400 plus flight, plus hotel, plus the other misnomer is plus the time.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So NAPE is, if you go to the entire thing, it's 3 days. Some of these other conferences are full day or 2 days. Mm-hmm. I mean, so in addition to, I'm lucky. I live in Midland, so a lot of the conferences are in Midland, right? So I don't have any travel expenses. I don't have to pay for a hotel when they're in Midland, but I still have to spend the time. If you're, I know somebody that came in a couple weeks back for a conference that I was a sponsor for. He came in from Florida. Mm-hmm. For a full day conference, but he came in from Florida. He booked the flight like 3 days prior to the conference because I was talking to him about it. And I mean, I don't know what he spent, but I mean, in terms of flight and hotel, that was probably a pile of money, especially being in Midland, right? Like,
right.
You probably paid up pretty good to do that.
No cheap hotels.
And the conference was a full day. I think it was $600. And I'll be candid, the conference there was. So I'll give one example that gives you a good idea. There was somebody talking about a new emissions technology that has started to take hold in California because out in California they have very rigorous standards and whatever. And so this emissions technology has really taken off there. And this guy, granted, the company was a sponsor for the event, so again that's why he was on stage. But he was talking about this technology, and one of the people in the Q&A, one of the guys on the floor, at least a half dozen times, there was a back and forth, at least a half dozen times asked this question in different ways, but basically said, you stood up in front of us and talked for 20 minutes about things that are happening in California. It's a vastly different environment out here. How does this apply to the Permian? Mm-hmm. And the response in different ways, half dozen times from the speaker was, oh, well, it's happening in California today, so it's going to be happening in your backyard tomorrow.
Right.
And it's, Okay, so number one, the speaker was clearly out of his element. He didn't know what room he was speaking to. But the other layer of that is who in the world made the decision to give that guy the stage? Those are the kind of things that I'm talking about. And so circling back, but the entire day was similar to that. I mean, there was very little value actually provided, and so. And not only that, it was, for whatever it's worth, it was at the Petroleum Club. So, the room was,
a little bit more upscale.
Yeah. And so I'm just very taken aback by things like that because, a $600 conference probably costs you like $2,000. I don't know what you paid in conferences last year because I know that you use the media pass when you can, et cetera. But I probably paid upwards of $10,000 easily in conference expenses just in a year. And I didn't even go to all of them. I went to the ones that I thought were really important, and I try to go to many of them in Midland because I'm out here. But $10,000 a year, that's a carry cost that a lot of people can't even fathom affording, much less like just right into the budget, right?
Right. No, you're right. I use the media pass if it's something that I want to go and cover from a podcast standpoint or whatnot. But I pay, but even then, I got to pay to go down there. I got to, I'm not doing anything else. I was just in China for 10 days. Well, when I'm in China, I did some work, but not much because I was 14 hours, as you know. I was 14 hours ahead. It was hard to communicate back here and all that stuff. And so that's obviously China's the extreme of what we're talking about. But, and luckily I had the group that the organizer stuff were nice enough to bring me over, so I had to pay for that. But I did lose a lot of productivity by my own choice. I'm not complaining, but being gone, that's the thing. Like you say, you go to a conference and, okay, if it's a good conference, then you can't pick up the phone and be emailing because you got to be engaged in the conference. If it's a bad conference, then you're emailing all day and you might as well stay at the office, right? And so so if it's a good conference, you're fine ignoring the phone calls and emails because that made it worth it. But if you're checking emails and texting all day and you're walking out to hop on conference calls, then you probably could have just stayed at the office or whatever.
It reminds me of the call or the conversation that you and I had a couple months back. I think it was where we were talking about, irrespective of how much you and I earn on a yearly basis, what do we actually value our time at on an hourly basis? It kind of brings to that, right? So if I were to broadcast, what number I gave you that day, and if you were to extrapolate that over an 8-hour conference or a 2-day, 15-hour conference, that's a lot of money that I'm sinking into this thing,
4.5 million a quarter. Yeah, I think that's what you said. 4.5 million a quarter. So I can't even do the math. You didn't give me the yearly. It's like a per quarter 4.5 million. So I don't even know how to do it. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah.
I don't even have a problem saying it on air. We can delete it if we'd like to. But the number I gave you that day, I told you my the way I value my time. This isn't what I charge, but the way that I value my time, $600 an hour. And so if you're talking about $600 an hour over a 2-day conference, that's a lot of opportunity cost money spent.
Yeah. Yeah. See, I value mine as potential upside. So the time is what's the potential upside? So $600 an hour is my minimum fee to get involved is $10 million. So that's kind of is it going to be more than $10 million or not? That's kind of where I start at. So. What do we say?
We all have different ways of looking at it, Nate's down here just taking notes. He's like, okay, so if Ryan's making $10 million and I get 1%, then
if Ryan's making $10 million, then we're not doing the show anymore. Wait, no, we're doing more shows. Wait, I did that backwards. We're doing more podcasts if Ryan's getting his $10 million fee.
I want to raise.
Yeah.
How about this? How about this? If the first time that you show me a $10 million check written out to Ryan Ray Sr., actually on the check, I'll jump in the lake the next January. How about that?
Well, what about if it's written out to R-Share Global because it's a deal I closed? Is that different? Me personally, well, man, the commies that run this country are going to tax me more if I get it made out to me personally. So you might have noticed a slight cut in the podcast there for a minute. What happened is Ben broke like 16 NDAs at one time, so we had to amend that to keep us all from being sued, maybe under federal indictment. What I was going to say, Ben,
you're fired, Ben.
Before you said that is I don't get the checks made out to me. I get it in cash, which, wait, now that I say that might be worse than what you said. But
Ryan
we're going to roll with that. We're going to roll with the cash. The cash isn't traceable. I will die on that hill. My $10 million, his money bags is laying around somewhere, allegedly.
God, I really hope one of us has like an FBI or IRS like agent in our listener or like in our audience.
Oh,
God,
good
please.
grief! Good grief! Yeah, please start with Ben, and then come to me. It'll take you a few years to work through all of his stuff. So by the time I'll be out of the country.
No, exactly. If you want the slam dunk, go to Ryan. Mine's gonna be a lot more complicated.
Wait. Because I'm telling on Ben, I get a cut of it. I'm a whistleblower. That's the rule. I'm a whistleblower. Go check out Ben's stuff and give me my cut. There it is. Let's roll the credits. Ben, it was great to have you on the show today. It was great to have you on the show today. IRS, please send that check in the mail. I do not take cash for anything. Everything I do is recorded, documented, and taxed appropriately. I actually overpay taxes just because I love my country that much. I'm a true patriot. Ben, any final thoughts before we get out of here today?
Bitcoin only, huh?
Big.
I would like my payment in Bitcoin, please. Thank you.
Bitcoin.
That MSA that we just signed, I'd like that in Bitcoin. Thank you.
Did Bitcoin hit 0 yet or not? I know it was like dying on the vine the other day.
I don't even know. I don't even know.
Don't even know.
So I'll tell a short story before we sign off. That'll what? No, you don't want me to?
I was looking at Bitcoin. Go ahead. I was looking at the price. Go ahead.
Oh, 73.15.
Okay.
At the moment.
Okay.
So I moved a couple weeks back, and I have I've got a number of those hardware wallets for my cryptocurrency that I hold. And for the people that don't know, they are. I'm going to make this really brief and at a high level. You have to have a password that is specific to your device that can't be copied. And without that code, if I were to lose the code to my device, I would never be able to get into the device, nor would anyone else. You have to have the code in order to get in, no matter what. And so I was moving, and I put the wallets, the hardware wallets, in one place, and I put the notes of what the codes were in a different place to make sure that they weren't together. Because if they were together and they got lost, I lose all the money no matter what.
You
right?
lose. This sounds like a lose-lose proposition we're going down. But go ahead.
Sort of. So I'm driving in a budget truck from Colorado to Texas. So on the Colorado side, I paid some people to pack the truck, but I packed every single box and taped every single box, and nobody, I did that. People moved the stuff onto the truck. I drove the truck to Texas, and then in Texas, in Midland, I had another company come and unload the stuff into my apartment. But there was nobody in transit that touched it or anything like that. And so I'm unpacking stuff, and I've only been in the apartment for 3 weeks now, and I was unpacking stuff, and I wasn't really worried about it because I knew that I was just going to working through things or whatever. And I found on the second day, I found the wallets, and then days later, I hadn't found the codes yet, and I'm starting to get a little freaked out because it's not a small amount of money that I have invested in these things, and so if I were to lose that, literally lose, yeah. So I was getting a little bit concerned. And then I had unpacked every single box in my apartment and hadn't found them yet. And so then panic started to set in. And I'm like, this is not good. What happened? So I called the complex and I was like, can you make sure that anybody that was in there, was there a piece of paper that I left? Whatever. In my head I was like, there's no possible way that I left it there, but trying everything.
Sure.
Right. I'm rifling through a notebook that I had that was packed in the same box as some other stuff. In the notebook, I had put the notes or the codes inside the notebook, but folded them so that they were kind of attached to the binding, so they couldn't come out.
Yeah.
And I guess I had forgotten that I did that because when I did that, I found all four of them. It wasn't a problem, but I was literally for a couple of days there, my heart was racing. I was I'm not going to mention numbers, but it's a number.
No wonder you've been cranky so much lately.
Yeah, this week has been bad. I've been sick. I've been sick. I thought I was out a pile of money.
Well, the good news here is a couple of things. One, you've told me you're a long-term buy and hold Bitcoin guy. So by the time you get rid of it, it'll be worth far less than it is today. So you wouldn't have lost much eventually because it'd be worth $10 by the time you decide to sell it. So really, it felt like a big loss today. But really, it wouldn't have been. So let me encourage you by saying that. Second, if you decide to give me those wallets and codes, I will cash them out for you. I'll make sure they're set up properly just to transact on them. Be happy to take care of that for you. Third, I don't know how I would
Go ahead. Can we make a bet on air? Can we before you go to third? Can we make a live bet on air?
Potentially. What's the bet?
So within the next, actually, I don't want to put a time limit on it. Yeah, within the next 3 years, if Bitcoin is not over $50,000 of Bitcoin, I'll pay you $5,000. But if it is, then you have to pay me $5,000.
So it's 5Gs. So we got to talk about it. If it hits it, because you got big money bags, you might go in there and just pump and dump it. So you're talking like long term hit 50K or just hit 50K one time?
Just has to blip above 50 one time for even a split second.
It's so volatile. It could do that and then go like to $1 the next day. That's the. Let me think about it.
So you don't have you don't want to back up your trash talk.
No. If you said it was going to be above 50,000 and stay there for months on end, I'll take that in a heartbeat. But to hit it for a second, it hit 20,000 or something like last year, and now it's at 7. So it can do a high peak, but then it just dies. So the question is, are the peaks higher?
In the next 3 years, if Bitcoin is above $50,000 for 7 consecutive days.
Again, it could do that. How long was it? 19,000 a couple years ago. We'll negotiate.
It was only 19,000 for like.
We'll negotiate off air. We'll negotiate off here. We'll come back to something with the listeners, and we'll put 5Gs on. I'm sure we can come to terms on it. And
what was third, by the way? Before we sign off, what was third? What were you going to say?
Third one, I don't know how. Third is because I don't think it's going to be worth anything by the time you sell it. I don't know how I would have reacted. Like, would I have been sad of the present value of the money for you, or would I have laughed at the future non-value of the money? I'd have been torn. I'd have been torn on how to react. Now, if you were going to cash it out today and you'd have lost, the hundreds of millions that you have tied up in it, I would have been sad. But because you're not, it's kind of hard for me to understand how much should I mourn this loss that didn't actually happen because it's not going to be worth anything. That would have been the question.
I feel like I thought you liked money more than you apparently do.
I'm just kidding. Ben, it was good to get back on here. Hope you get feeling well, buddy. I know you've toughed it through for us. It was your Jordan flu game, and so we appreciate that. For the listeners, 5-star review for Bringing the Closers, Texas Oil and Gas Podcast. I think it's like maxed out or something, so no worries on that. And Nate will be in the lake here in January, so we'll have some posts about that for your entertainment. Ben, good to talk to you. We'll be back next week.
Sounds good, Ron. Appreciate it.